March 1943, the Bismarck Sea. When American and Australian pilots completed what seemed like a flawless military victory, they did something that left the Japanese utterly stunned. For 3 consecutive days, they ruthlessly strafed over 3,000 Japanese survivors floating helplessly on the ocean's surface. This wasn't a war crimes trial. This wasn't post-war retribution. This was happening in real time, ordered directly by commanding officers during active combat. What shocked the Japanese wasn't the defeat itself. It was the sudden realization that the Americans had completely abandoned the rules of warfare they thought they understood. This was a perfect victory of technology, tactics, and intelligence, but it was also a massacre that neither side would ever be able to reconcile. Today, we're telling you the complete truth behind what's known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. By early 1943, the Pacific War had entered its second year. Japan's failure at Guadalcanal left their defensive lines across the Solomon Islands and New Guinea dangerously exposed. Without immediate reinforcements to these regions, their entire South Pacific strategic defense would collapse completely. So the Japanese Navy devised a massive reinforcement operation, codenamed Operation 81. The scale of this convoy was staggering: 8 massive transport ships, each packed with soldiers, tanks, artillery, and supplies. 4 destroyers provided escort. The entire fleet carried 6,900 elite troops. Destination: Lae, on the northeastern coast of New Guinea. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were elite forces from the Japanese Army's 51st Division, rigorously trained, superbly equipped. Their mission: reverse the tide of war and reclaim Allied strongholds across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Commanding this convoy was Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. An experienced naval officer, Kimura understood the critical importance of this mission. His plan was straightforward: avoid Allied main fleets and air bases, sail along the northern coast of New Britain, use darkness and foul weather as cover, and slip quietly into Lae. In Kimura's view, the plan was nearly flawless. They'd depart at night, hide near islands during daylight, evading Allied reconnaissance aircraft. As long as they avoided the Allied main force, they'd complete the mission successfully. But what Kimura didn't know was that far away in Pearl Harbor and Melbourne, Allied intelligence personnel already knew every detail of their plan. It all started with a secret code-breaking team. In the Pacific War, there was a battle ordinary soldiers would never see: the Cipher War. Back in 1942, U.S. Naval Intelligence had established a code-breaking unit designated Magic. This team had one mission: crack Japanese naval communications. The Japanese Navy used a cipher system called JN-25, an extraordinarily complex code employing multiple encryption layers and codebooks, theoretically almost impossible to break, but the Americans did it. Through months of effort, the Magic team successfully cracked key portions of the JN-25 cipher. By early 1943, they could read most Japanese naval communications in real time. So while Kimura's convoy was still preparing to depart from Rabaul Harbor, Allied command already knew every detail. Departure time: setting sail from Rabaul at dawn on March 1st. Route: around the northern side of New Britain, along the Papua New Guinea coastline. Formation: 8 transports in the center, 4 destroyers dispersed around them for escort. Speed: approximately 7 knots per hour. Expected arrival at Lae on March 3rd. Even the cargo weight, firepower configuration, and unit designations of the embarked troops, everything was crystal clear. Lieutenant General George Kenney, commander of the U.S. 5th Air Force, looked at this intelligence report with a cold smile spreading across his face. Kenney was a typical pragmatist. He didn't believe in chivalry or honor in warfare. He believed in one thing: destroying the enemy in the fastest, most ruthless, most effective way possible. His motto: war isn't a knight's tournament, it's about using every means necessary to eliminate the enemy. Kenney immediately assembled his staff and devised a bold operational plan. He would completely annihilate this Japanese convoy over the Bismarck Sea. But Kenney knew traditional bombing methods had limited effectiveness against fast-moving ships. He needed a new weapon, something that could strike ships with precision at low altitude. So he sought out a legendary figure, Captain Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Paul Gunn was a legendary pilot and engineer. Before the war, he'd been chief pilot for Philippine Airlines, intimately familiar with aircraft performance. When war broke out, he joined the U.S. Army Air Forces as a bomber pilot. But Gunn quickly realized traditional high-altitude bombing was highly ineffective against ships. Bombs dropped from high altitude gave targets plenty of time to maneuver evasively. Moreover, high-altitude bombing accuracy was poor, often requiring dozens of bombs to hit a single ship. Gunn started thinking, what if bombs could be delivered at low altitude? Wouldn't that improve hit rates? So he began boldly modifying B-25 Mitchell bombers. First, he removed the bomb bay from the aircraft's belly, reducing weight and improving speed and maneuverability. Then he installed 8.50 caliber Browning heavy machine guns in the nose, all forward-facing, creating a dense wall of fire. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, the firepower equaled a light cruiser's secondary batteries, capable of shredding everything on deck in seconds. Most critically, Gunn developed an entirely new attack tactic, skip bombing. The principle was simple. Aircraft fly at extremely low altitude, less than 50 meters, just above the sea surface, then release bombs. The bombs don't drop straight down, but skip across the water like stones skipping on a pond, 2 or 3 bounces, then penetrate the ship's hull below the waterline before detonating. This attack method's power was devastating. Bombs exploding below the waterline directly tear apart the ship's structural integrity, causing massive flooding. And because the bombs penetrate from the side, the ship's armor and protective systems are virtually useless. But this tactic was also extremely dangerous. Aircraft had to fly below 50 meters, meaning pilots had virtually zero margin for error. The slightest mistake and the plane would plunge straight into the ocean. Moreover, at such low altitude, aircraft were highly vulnerable to enemy anti-aircraft fire. So those 8 machine guns Gunn installed in the nose had another purpose. Before releasing bombs, suppress enemy anti-aircraft guns with concentrated fire, creating conditions for the bomb run. These modified B-25s transformed from ordinary bombers into flying gunships. When Kenney saw these modified B-25s, he immediately recognized this was the weapon he needed. He ordered all 5th Air Force B-25s to undergo similar modifications and had Gunn personally train pilots in this new tactic. Now everything was ready. The hunters had sharpened their claws and fangs, waiting for prey to walk into the trap. At dawn on March 1, 1943, Kimura's convoy quietly departed Rabaul Harbor. Darkness concealed this massive fleet. 8 transports lined up, 4 destroyers dispersed around them on alert. Most of the 6,900 soldiers aboard were already asleep, unaware that death awaited them ahead. Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer Arashio, gazing out at the pitch-black sea. Everything was proceeding according to plan. They'd travel by night, rest near islands during the day, avoiding Allied reconnaissance aircraft. But what Kimura didn't know was that the Allies didn't need reconnaissance aircraft to find them, because they already knew exactly where they'd appear. On the morning of March 2nd, an Allied B-24 reconnaissance aircraft happened to discover the Japanese fleet. I say happened because the Allies already knew the Japanese fleet would appear at that location. Sending the reconnaissance aircraft was just for show, so the Japanese wouldn't suspect their codes had been broken. News of the fleet's discovery immediately reached Allied command. Lieutenant General Kenney issued the attack order, full deployment, leave no survivors. At 6:30 a.m. on March 3rd, the first wave of attacks began. 13 modified B-25 bombers, led by Australian Flight Lieutenant Bill Newton, charged toward the Japanese convoy at less than 50 meters altitude, skimming the sea surface. Japanese lookouts aboard the fleet quickly spotted these aircraft. Alarm bells rang, anti-aircraft gunners scrambled to their positions, but they quickly realized these planes were completely different from any they'd encountered before. They were flying far too low, so low that anti-aircraft guns could barely aim at them. Bill Newton's B-25 charged out front. When the distance closed to 800 meters, he pressed the firing button. 8.50 caliber machine guns fired simultaneously, orange tracers drawing deadly arcs through the dawn sky. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners on deck didn't even have time to react before being torn to shreds by concentrated bullets. Blood mist and fragments of flesh scattered across the deck. Then Newton released the first bomb. The bomb didn't fall directly into the sea, but skipped twice across the water's surface, then precisely penetrated the side of the transport Aoku Maru, exploding below the waterline. With a massive explosion, Aoku Maru's hull was blown open. Seawater surged madly into the hull. The ship began listing violently. But this was only the beginning. The remaining 12 B-25s charged in one after another, machine guns strafing, bombs released. Each carried 4 500-pound bombs, and virtually every bomb found its mark. Skip bombing's effectiveness exceeded expectations. These bombs seemed guided, one after another penetrating hulls and exploding below waterlines. The transport's armor and protection were useless against this type of attack. In less than 15 minutes, 5 of the 8 transports had been hit and were sinking. The remaining 3 were also riddled with holes, billowing smoke. The 4 escort destroyers tried to fight back, but they quickly became the next targets. Though destroyers were fast and maneuverable, they couldn't evade such concentrated attacks. One bomb after another struck targets, explosions erupting in succession. The sea surface was covered with burning wreckage and floating bodies. Soldiers aboard the transports panicked. Some tried jumping into the sea to escape, others hid in compartments praying. Still others tried manning ship-mounted anti-aircraft guns to return fire, but were quickly riddled by machine gun fire. Bill Newton's aircraft, after completing its bomb run, was preparing to return when a Japanese anti-aircraft shell struck his wing. The plane began smoking and lost control. Newton struggled to control the aircraft, attempting to ditch on the sea surface, but the plane ultimately plunged into the water. Newton and his crew were rescued by Japanese forces, but executed several months later. After the war, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the Commonwealth's highest military honor. After the first wave of attacks, the sea surface resembled a hellscape. All 8 transports were sunk or critically damaged, the 4 destroyers also heavily damaged. Thousands of Japanese soldiers jumped into the sea to escape, floating on the surface, clinging to planks, life rings, even corpses, trying to swim toward the nearest destroyers. They thought the attack was over, but they were wrong. The real massacre was just beginning. At 10 a.m. on March 3rd, the second wave of attacks began. But this time, the targets weren't ships. They were the survivors floating on the sea surface. Lieutenant General Kenney issued a clear order: continue attacking surface targets until nothing moves. The order's meaning was explicit: leave no survivors. P-38 Lightning fighters, B-25 bombers, even fighters took turns carpet strafing the sea surface. Machine gun bullets poured down like torrential rain, throwing up columns of water. Japanese soldiers clinging to planks and life rings were hit one after another, sinking beneath the waves. The seawater turned red with blood. Some Japanese soldiers tried raising their hands in surrender, but the aircraft paid no attention, continuing to strafe. Some tried diving underwater to hide, but when they surfaced for air, waiting aircraft would hit them. Others tried playing dead, floating motionless on the surface, but aircraft fired on anything that looked human, whether alive or dead. This strafing continued for 3 full days. On March 3rd, 4th, and 5th, Allied aircraft flew over 300 sorties, conducting continuous attacks on survivors at sea. Lifeboats were riddled with holes, planks shattered to pieces, even floating corpses were torn apart. One Australian pilot later wrote in his diary, "We flew over the sea and saw not enemies but masses of heads, like swarms of black ants floating. But orders are orders, so we pulled the triggers. Those people fell in waves like cut grass." Another American pilot said in an interview years later, "I saw a man clinging to a door plank waving at me. I don't know if he was asking for rescue, surrendering, or just instinctively trying to get attention. But I didn't have time to think. I pressed the firing button. His body twisted like a rag under the bullet impacts, then sank into the water. In that moment, I didn't know if he was an enemy or just someone trying to survive. I'll never forget that image." The Japanese destroyers Arashio and Yukikaze attempted rescue operations, but they themselves were under continuous air attack. Ultimately, they could only abandon rescue efforts and hastily withdraw from the battlefield. Of the 4 destroyers, 2 were sunk, 2 escaped with damage. They rescued only about 800 survivors total. The rest either died from strafing or, after floating at sea for days, perished from dehydration, blood loss, or shark attacks. The final statistics: of 6,900 Japanese troops who boarded the ships, only about 800 were rescued. Over 3,000 died, and of those 3,000 dead, at least half were killed by aerial strafing after the ship sank. When news reached Japan, the entire Japanese military was stunned. What shocked them wasn't the defeat itself. In war, defeats are inevitable. Japanese military personnel were mentally prepared for that. What shocked them was the Americans' method of warfare. In Japanese Bushido culture, warfare had rules. Even enemies, once they'd lost combat capability, should be regarded as unarmed persons and no longer attacked. Soldiers in the water should be rescued, even enemy soldiers. This wasn't just humanitarian, it stemmed from warrior honor. A true warrior doesn't attack defenseless enemies. This concept was deeply rooted in Japanese culture, centuries old. So when Japanese survivors were rescued, their first reaction wasn't anger, but confusion and shock. One survivor said in a post-war interview, "We thought the Americans would follow Bushido's spirit, would rescue people in the water, or at least wouldn't attack us. But they didn't. They shot us like fish. I floated in the water for 12 hours, watching my comrades killed one after another. I hid under an oil drum, diving underwater every time I heard aircraft. I survived not because of courage, but because of luck. In that moment, we realized this wasn't war, it was slaughter." Another survivor said, "I raised my hands trying to surrender, but the planes completely ignored it, continuing to fire. Bullets hit the water around me, throwing up spray. I dove underwater, bullets whizzing over my head. When I surfaced again, everyone around me was dead. In that moment, I understood the Americans didn't care whether we surrendered. They just wanted all of us dead." Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, fell into prolonged silence upon receiving this news. Yamamoto was an officer who'd studied in America for years. He understood Americans better than most Japanese, but even he hadn't anticipated the Americans would adopt such total annihilation tactics. He wrote in his diary, "The Americans no longer see this as war, but as a campaign of extermination. They're using the most efficient methods to eliminate our fighting forces, leaving no room. The rules of warfare we believed in simply don't exist in their eyes. This war is far more brutal than I imagined." Yamamoto immediately ordered an investigation into how the Allies could so precisely know their routes and timing. The investigation quickly discovered their codes had been broken. But this discovery came too late. Broken codes meant all their communications were exposed to the enemy. This wasn't just a tactical failure, but a strategic disaster. From that point forward, the Japanese Navy never dared use surface convoys again. All supplies were delivered by submarine or nighttime airdrop, dramatically reducing efficiency and massively increasing costs. The strategic balance of the Pacific War, from this moment, tipped decisively. But on the Allied side, the assessment of this operation was completely different. Lieutenant General Kenney wrote in his post-war report, "The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a textbook victory. We used intelligence advantage, technical superiority, and tactical innovation to annihilate an important enemy reinforcement force with minimal cost. This operation not only prevented Japanese reinforcement of New Guinea, but more importantly, it demonstrated our air power to the Japanese." From that point on, the Japanese never again dared use surface transport during daylight. In Kenney's view, every element of this operation was necessary, including strafing survivors. He explained in his report, "If we didn't eliminate these survivors, they'd be rescued, sent back to the battlefield, then continue killing our soldiers. These weren't civilians, they were soldiers, trained combat personnel. Saving them would be releasing tigers back to the mountain, so we had no choice but to completely eliminate them." Kenney also cited data to support his decision. The 6,900 soldiers aboard the convoy were elite forces from Japan's 51st Division. If they'd successfully reached Lae, they would have significantly strengthened Japanese defenses in New Guinea, potentially causing Allied forces thousands of additional casualties in future operations. Now, by eliminating this force, the Allies avoided those future casualties. From a purely military perspective, Kenney's logic was unassailable. War's purpose is eliminating enemy fighting forces, and this operation perfectly achieved that purpose. The Allies lost only 6 aircraft and 13 pilots, while sinking 12 Japanese vessels and eliminating nearly 3,000 enemy troops. By any standard, this exchange ratio represented an enormous victory. But from a moral perspective, this operation left questions that can never be answered. After the war, controversy over the Battle of the Bismarck Sea never ceased. Some historians argue that strafing people in the water violated the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions clearly state that enemy personnel who have lost combat capability should be treated as prisoners of war, receiving humanitarian protection. Soldiers in the water had obviously lost combat capability. But other historians point out the Geneva Convention's definition of lost combat capability is ambiguous. These waterborne soldiers hadn't laid down weapons to surrender, they were merely temporarily in an unfavorable position. If rescued, they could completely return to the battlefield, so technically they remained legitimate targets. Moreover, the operational environment at the time must be considered. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea occurred in 1943 when the Pacific War was far from over. The Allies lacked resources to rescue and guard thousands of prisoners. Even if they'd rescued these Japanese soldiers, how would they handle them? Where would they send them? Who would guard them? These were practical questions. More importantly, Japanese forces had committed countless atrocities during this war. The Bataan Death March, the Nanjing Massacre, torture of prisoners. These crimes filled many Allied soldiers with hatred toward Japanese military personnel. In their view, these Japanese soldiers didn't deserve sympathy. One Australian pilot who participated in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea said years later, "I know firing on people in the water is morally problematic, but I also know what these Japanese did in the Philippines, in Singapore, in China. A friend of mine was tortured to death by the Japanese during the Bataan Death March. So when I saw those Japanese struggling in the water, I felt no compassion. I was just completing my mission." After the war, Allied leadership discussed whether to investigate commanders and pilots involved in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea for war crimes, but ultimately, no one was prosecuted. The reason was simple. In war, every side did similar things. If accountability for the Bismarck Sea battle were pursued, then responsibility for all similar actions throughout the entire war would need pursuing. In that case, nearly every high-ranking commander would end up in court. So the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was buried in history's gray zone, neither officially praised nor officially condemned, simply recorded as fact in history books, left for later generations to judge. But for those who personally experienced this battle, the Bismarck Sea would forever be an unforgettable nightmare. Lieutenant General Kenney wrote in his post-war memoir, "I don't regret sinking those ships, that was my duty, but strafing people in the water, that's what I least want to remember in my life. Every time I think of that sea, I dream of those people struggling in the water. I know they were enemies, soldiers. But in that moment, they were just people trying to survive." Many pilots who participated in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea suffered severe psychological trauma after the war. One American pilot said in an interview years later, "I still have nightmares. I dream of that sea, those heads, the moment I pulled the trigger. I know I was just following orders, just completing my mission. But that doesn't give me peace. Years later, I still wonder how many of those people could have survived, how many were just ordinary soldiers forced to participate in this war, how many had wives, children, parents waiting for them to come home." Another pilot said, "After the war ended, I went to Japan, stayed in Tokyo for months. I saw those Japanese people on the streets, saw their children, saw their elderly. I thought, the people we killed in the Bismarck Sea might have been these people's fathers, husbands, sons. In that moment, I suddenly realized we weren't killing numbers or enemies, but living, breathing human beings. That kept me awake for an entire week." For Japanese survivors, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was an eternal wound. One survivor said in a 1980 interview, "I floated in the water for 12 hours. I watched my comrades killed one after another, watched the seawater turn red with blood. I hid under an oil drum, diving underwater every time I heard aircraft. I survived purely by luck. After the war ended, I returned to Japan, but I could never live a normal life again. Every time I hear aircraft, I tremble. Every time I see the ocean, I think of those floating corpses. This nightmare has followed me my entire life." The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't just a military victory, it was a test of humanity. It showed us what war becomes when technology crushes humanity, when efficiency replaces honor, when cold rationality defeats moral sensitivity. From a military perspective, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was one of World War II's most successful air-sea coordinated operations. It proved several points. First, intelligence's importance in modern warfare. The key factor enabling the Allies' perfect victory was advanced knowledge of Japan's complete plan. Cipher warfare became an indispensable part of modern war. Second, technological innovation can transform warfare's face. Captain Gunn's B-25 modifications created an entirely new attack method, rendering traditional ship defense systems completely ineffective. Skip bombing technique was later written into textbooks, becoming one of modern ground attacks' foundational tactics. Third, air power can completely sever sea supply lines. After the Bismarck Sea battle, Japan never again dared use surface transport. All supplies switched to submarines or nighttime airdrops, dramatically reducing efficiency. This directly quickly caused Japan's logistical crisis in the Pacific Theater, accelerating the war's end. But from a moral perspective, the lessons left by the Battle of the Bismarck Sea are far more complex. It showed us that in total war, traditional warfare rules and moral principles are often replaced by efficiency and pragmatism. When eliminating the enemy becomes the only goal, humanity and honor get cast aside. This isn't a question of right or wrong, but of choice. Lieutenant General Kenney chose efficiency, chose complete enemy annihilation, even if it meant firing on defenseless people in the water. His choice, from a military perspective, was correct. It genuinely prevented Japanese reinforcement and saved more Allied soldiers' lives. But this choice also permanently changed warfare's nature. From then on, war was no longer honorable combat between warriors, but war of annihilation between nations. Technology, efficiency, and rationality replaced honor, chivalry, and humanity. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked one era's end and another's beginning. On the Bismarck Sea floor today still lie those 8 Japanese transport ships' wreckage. They rest quietly there like silent tombstones, commemorating those who died in this battle. Of these people, how many names are remembered? How many stories told? We know Lieutenant General Kenney's name, know Captain Gunn's name, know Flight Lieutenant Bill Newton's name. But what about those 6,900 Japanese soldiers, those who struggled in the water, ultimately sinking to the seafloor? History often only remembers victors' names while forgetting losers' faces. But they were living, breathing people too, also had families, friends, dreams, perhaps conscripted farmers, perhaps young men enlisting for family honor, perhaps soldiers believing they were defending their nation. But in that moment, on the Bismarck Sea's surface, they were all just numbers, targets that needed eliminating. War's cruelty isn't only in taking lives, but in stripping those lives of meaning. The dead are no longer individuals, but just numbers on battle reports, units for calculating exchange ratios. One historian once said, "War makes us forget that enemies are human too. They also have names, stories, people who love them. But in war, we must forget these things or we can't pull the trigger." The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was the ultimate manifestation of this forgetting. Years later, a reporter asked Lieutenant General Kenney, "If you could do it over, would you still give that order?" Kenney was silent for a long time, then said, "Yes, I'd still give that order, because that was my duty. My duty was protecting my soldiers, winning this war. If we'd spared those Japanese soldiers, they'd return to the battlefield and kill my men, so I had no choice." Then he added, "But that doesn't mean I'm proud of that decision. Some things, even if necessary, don't mean they're right." Perhaps this is the best summary of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. In war, sometimes there are no right choices, only necessary ones. Kenney chose efficiency, chose complete enemy elimination, militarily necessary. But this choice also burdened him with a lifetime's moral weight. Pilots who participated in the Bismarck Sea battle faced the same dilemma. They knew they were just following orders, completing missions, but that didn't give them peace. One pilot said in his later years, "I don't hate the Japanese, I hate war. War made us do things we didn't want to do, made us become people we didn't want to be. If back in 1943, I'd still pull the trigger because that was my duty. But that doesn't mean I don't feel pain over it." War never has winners. Even the victorious side carries scars. Today, the Bismarck Sea has returned to calm. The water there remains azure blue, the sky still bright, as if that massacre 80+ years ago never happened. But on the seafloor, those 8 transport ships' wreckage still rest quietly. Occasionally, divers visit, seeing those corroded hulls, scattered weapons, wreckage covered by marine life. This wreckage bears witness to history, the only remaining trace of that battle. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed the Pacific War's trajectory and changed our understanding of warfare. It tells us that in modern war, traditional honor and moral principles are often replaced by efficiency and technology. It tells us war isn't the heroism of movies, but cold, mechanized killing. But most importantly, it tells us war's cost isn't just loss of life, but loss of humanity. When Lieutenant General Kenney issued that order, when pilots pressed triggers, when those Japanese soldiers sank to the seafloor, part of humanity sank with them. This is war's truth. No honor, no chivalry, no bushido. Only victory and defeat, only life and death, only wounds that never heal. What shocked the Japanese at the Bismarck Sea wasn't defeat itself, but their first realization. Modern warfare had completely abandoned the rules they understood. In this new war era, efficiency was the only standard, enemy elimination the only goal. And this recognition was more brutal than any tactical defeat, because it meant humanity humanity had entered a new era, an era where technology crushes humanity, efficiency replaces honor, cold rationality defeats moral sensitivity. This is the true lesson the Battle of the Bismarck Sea leaves us. War is never the answer. It only brings suffering, death, and wounds that never heal. Whether victors or vanquished, all lose something in war, perhaps life, perhaps comrades, perhaps innocence, perhaps faith in humanity. And these lost things can never be recovered. That sea surface, once stained red with blood, has now returned to calm. But history won't forget what happened there. Those 3,000 souls who sank to the seafloor remain there forever, becoming history's eternal witnesses. They remind us war's cost is far heavier than we imagine, and preventing war is humanity's eternal responsibility.